Hello and welcome to The Table. This is a wrap-up episode for Edible Empire, a podcast series about the hidden cost of our food. Hosted by Planet Pulse Pacific, we're your hosts, Ben, Neal, and Emma, with Kelly on editing. Connecting from across the globe, we would like to take a moment and acknowledge the traditional custodians and the millennia of stewardship. We honour the deep, ongoing connection to lands and environments that we discuss throughout the series.
Welcome to the Epilogue episode of our podcast series. As we bring this journey to a close, we return to the questions that started it all. What are the true costs of our food and who pays for them? Can we imagine a fairer world where the food on our plates doesn't cost the earth? Over these 6 episodes, we've traced the white gold of New Zealand dairy back to the occupied lands of Western Sahara, and followed the path of palm oil from its colonial roots in West Africa to the modern supermarket shelf. We've seen that the modern food empire is no longer defined by flags, but by annual reports, and by the vast corporate power of agri-food giants that operate within the reach of sovereign states. From overfished coasts of West Africa to the intensive greenhouses of Almeria, the hidden links of food imperialism have relied on a playbook of resource extraction and labour exploitation.
We've seen how a few massive multinational corporations dominate the food system, creating an hourglass that squeezes both producers and consumers. This model often generates the very crises it claims to solve, masking the true cost of our food, from the blood phosphate of Western Sahara to the disappearance of local fish in West Africa. By enforcing uneven trade rules and coercive monocultures, food imperialism continues to prioritise profit over the soil and the people who tend it.
We've heard that a fairer future lies within concepts like food sovereignty and degrowth, democratic control of what and how we produce food, and by mobilizing and fighting for more protection for workers and small-scale farmers. By challenging corporate middlemen and the narratives they use to sell us intensively produced cheap food, we can rebuild the transparency lost to global commodity chains. This journey starts with our own relationship to food, one that has been eroded by decades, if not centuries, of treating us, the consumer, as the commodity. To quote Professor Phil Howard from episode 2, this is a food system that we have that was created by humans, and it can be changed by humans. This food system was not inevitable. So without further ado, what did you guys think about the series?
Well, I think firstly, what I've been amazed by in this series is the number of leading experts that we've had, people who are really the most knowledgeable people in their field, talking about everything from the high level stuff all down to the real detail. So it's really that breadth of a number of people who've been willing very kindly to chat to us.
And what I hope becomes crystal clear by the end of the series for listeners is that food imperialism isn't just a collection of separate issues, because we've talked about a really wide range of topics here, from palm oil to salmon to dairy to migration to illegally mined phosphate to equity concerns, impacts on climate, like the list goes on. But they're all kind of manifestations of that same underlying logic.
The food you choose to put on your plate has an impact far further reaching than just our own country or part of the world. And this is something we really hope that our listeners not only understand, but start becoming equipped and better informed to make those better decisions.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one thing that really struck me as well was the connections between those systems are, so messy and multilateral that, we saw connections between episodes that we hadn't necessarily thought of before, like the connection between New Zealand dairy and palm kernel. And, that observations that there were the same kind of urgent adaptation to extreme circumstances in the Sahrawi people who were refugees in Algeria, to the migrants working in the greenhouses of southern Spain.
And also how similar the same concept in different parts of the world are. For instance, the salmon farming. We think in New Zealand and Australia we do it very differently, very clean, but its origins go back to the exact same, the rationale of why it was started and the way it's carried out. So again, we're not immune because we think we're in a different part of the world. The outcomes are still the same.
Yeah. So, Neal, what did our first episode on history and the global food system tell us about the role of food imperialism and the state of contemporary food systems?
Yeah, I think that this is a really important point that we saw actually repeated across the series, right? So obviously Harriet Friedman, the expert in food regimes, brought that understanding of why we need a historical lens to understand the food system that we have today, but also Jonathan Robbins talking about the history of palm oil and how that colonial history in exploiting West African palm oil in situ really paved the way for a continued massive increase in scale of production through the plantations that spread in Southeast Asia. So the importance of looking at history to understand why things are the way they are today really struck me. And I think as well, this idea that the food system that we have today didn't just evolve. It's the result of a combination of very directed aims of the original empires that established our globalized food system, the British Empire and then US control after World War II, but also that it is a result of chaos alongside that, and that a lot of what we have today that demonstrates the food system not working, that it's sort of in some ways broken because of those externalities that aren't accounted for, that, you know, as Raj Patel was saying, corporations are not picking up the tab. Those are demonstrations that we're sort of down a cul-de-sac with a food system that actually nobody really wants. So I think like the importance of the historical lens from a food imperialism perspective was really clear throughout a lot of the episodes. And some of the other things that people said were really important as well, that, you know, throughout history, throughout the examples we've seen, the connection between people and the land has been destroyed, often deliberately, to break people's ability to look after themselves in terms of food, to make them dependent on food imports, paying for food, and generating profit. And so that like simplification of food production, export-oriented food systems is how that's done. It's this playbook of, you know, how do you break people from the connection to the land? And, you know, one of the quotes that also stuck with me right from the last episode was Ali Thomas saying that it's our relationship with food that has to change, that we've lost the connection actually with where food comes from. So I think that's why looking at food history is so important. But then there are other indications that something has been wrong for a long time, like what Raj Patel was saying about one of the key aspects of food imperialism is that as you've got increasing production of food, volume and profit, you've got increasing hunger, right? So that productivity hunger paradox that is really a sign that something's going wrong. And that's been around for a really long time. If you look at the British control of India and what Raj was explaining about the frequency of famines under British control increasing drastically. And, you know, tied to that, we had references to historical simplification of landscapes as well, that Jonathan Robbins was talking about the flattening and simplification of landscapes. And that was really reflected in what Fariza Farhan was saying about what's happening in Indonesia to the really important Leuser ecosystem, that flattening. And again, what we have heard is happening to the ecosystems in Almeria as a result of the expansion of the intensification of food systems there as well. So when we take a historical lens, we see the same patterns of colonial control and destruction and breaking between people and the land that is really driving food as a commodity for profit and increasing hunger and all of those negative costs of food production at the same time.
Now, one of the common themes that we've also seen in this series is that colonialism and corporations go hand in hand. So, what about the role of corporations here? They seem to have repeatedly called out as being the key driver of the problems many of our guests mentioned with the food system.
Yeah, I think that is something that it started out with our discussion with Harriet Friedman, where she was talking about this idea that corporations might be the new form of a third food regime. And we heard that debate about, is it really a corporate food regime, or is this still the result of state freedom? So the corporations wouldn't have that power if the state hadn't allowed them to. So, who is in control, and how much is that a stable state that we're in versus a continuing transitional state? But whether it was the fault of the states freeing things up for corporations, or the increasing power that corporations were getting through money that allowed them to control the states and then their own freedom, for sure we've heard that corporations are increasingly and worryingly controlling power in the food system. So this was really what Phil Howard and Jennifer Clapp were talking about, where we've got this hourglass system, this hourglass form for the food system. You've got millions and millions of producers across the world. You've got billions of consumers. Everybody on the planet is a consumer. And in the middle, you've got this pinch point with just thousands of corporations who control the processing, transport, and wholesale of food. And several people in the podcast talked about the mystification and false choice that we have. So you might go down the supermarket and see 10,000 different products, but actually they're owned by under 100 different companies. In some aisles, it might be just a handful. And that, when you look at who owns, you look at the back of a product because you don't perhaps want to buy Coca-Cola, but you buy some water, and that water is owned by Coca-Cola. And when you look into it, you really do see that corporate control. And that is, the sort of the physicality of that hourglass shape. And there are so many concerns with a lack of competition from these massive monopolies. You see that they have more power, they have more money, they have more control. They have a huge ability to lobby and control legislation, and to cause that a relaxation of laws around the responsibility that they have for people on the planet. And, part of that control comes from this food imperialistic playbook, that play of hiding how much control they have and trying to keep consumers blind to not only the state of the food system, but also the costs that they are producing. So I think that really tight bottleneck was something that we've seen time and again through the series. And I think we heard about this particularly with the salmon farming industry, it's a food production system that has evolved in a really short period of time in terms of contemporary history. That from the 1970s, it went from being thousands of small family businesses. You have a farm, you also have a net in the fjord where you grow a few thousand fish, maybe, to what we have today, which in Scotland is 8 corporations running a huge business, producing 200,000 tons of salmon a year. That's dropped from 170 something businesses in the 1980s. And along with that development in the salmon farming industry has been the ability to lobby EU and national governments around how many chemicals, what types of chemicals they can put into the environment and expose their fish to. That something that might be categorized as toxic today is actually allowed because of lobbying. So I think we really can't underestimate the impact that corporations have. And Phil Howard talked about the domination of the seed market by really just 4 companies dominate 50% of the seed market, I think it was, which is really shocking and a huge change from 20 years ago as well. So that change has happened very, very quickly.
As a consumer, what really got to me was, you've already mentioned it, but just how that concentration of power is so invisible. So it makes it so hard to do the right thing if you're wanting to go to the supermarket and support a smaller brand or an ethical brand. And at the end of the day, it's probably owned by one of the big 4 anyway. So it's very frustrating.
It is, isn't it? And I think there was a moment where one of our guests was talking about that and my heart broke a little bit, because I do try to buy in a way that matches my moral compass. And
Mm.
within the food restrictions that I have because of my dietary requirements, I do try to buy things that are organic, things that are better for the planet, better for people. They've got these fair trade certifications, all of that. And then, yeah, one of our guests was like, yeah, those are all just a minority few choices that are owned by the same brand. So they still get your money. And then that allows them to sell 80 or 90% of their products that don't have those certifications. And that's where they're making all of their profit. So yeah, that was a little bit bleak for me, I think.
Now, speaking of corporate influence, it is, well, I was going to say well known, maybe a lot don't realize, but a lot of research, a lot of institutions, academic, but even sort of standalone, receive funding from corporations. Now, an observation that we've made through the original interviews, and I wonder if some of our listeners have picked up on this as well, is Dr. Mike Joyce talks a lot about this, and I think he mentioned this in the interview as well, the requirement, the academic requirement for critical consciousness. And the observation we made was that we got a sense that some of our guests didn't have what we felt was the freedom to truly express themselves, whereas others couldn't care and just said it as it is. What are your thoughts in terms of that corporate influence in academia and how that can impede in speaking out?
Yeah, I think that was a really interesting observation. I mean, we said it when we interviewed and introduced Raj Patel, right? That, he's an author, he's a documentary filmmaker, he's an activist and a researcher. And actually the sort of researcher part was a little bit of an addendum to the description of the many things that he's done. And he's very happy and very keen to be known as an activist. I think for many other academics, that's not the case, that this word sort of has a bit of a dangerous connotation to it. My experience of academia is certainly that people are quite cautious about any kind of policy prescriptions that they might choose to make, and that has to be taken from a very carefully thought out point of demonstrable independence. But I think what you do see from our series is that the guests who are investigative journalists, the guests who are perhaps not affiliated with a position, might be speaking in a slightly different way. And yeah, I think there are areas where, in this age of increasing power of corporations, I can see that academics are in a difficult point, right? So if you're in a policy facing or practice facing role in academia, you're wanting to help people make better decisions, then the people you want to get around the table are the corporations. At the same time, they might be funding some of the work because they have this, at least thinking cynically, a PR drive to be seen to be trying to make themselves better. So there's a lot of big corporations that fund research. And if you want to continue getting funding, you might not want to be overly negative or critical about corporations. So I think that is a tension that I don't think academia gets particularly right all the time. But there are a couple of episodes where I think there's perhaps a little bit of an apparent tension between the activist side of conversations and the research of, the importance of the economy, or transitions towards getting better. Is it okay that people are trying to get better? Should they be trying harder? What happens if you push people to try harder and they just leave the table? So yeah, I think there are, particularly in respect to my journey where I've been working in academia and left academia largely to focus on more investigative work around these externalities of social and environmental impacts, I've sort of really observed that tension and then the release of that tension firsthand. So that was something that I've really noticed. But it's a tricky one. How do you work within? And I think this speaks to how we behave as consumers, how we behave as citizens within capitalism. How do you exist within a system that's a bit broken? And it's not necessarily a criticism of people who are trying to work within the system versus people who are calling for absolute radical change. I think there's a need for both of those voices. But yeah, I think it's a good observation.
Another thing we saw was this idea of externalities in our globalized food supply chains. That, the social and environmental impacts of our food habits in the global north, which are actually the global minority here, are pushed onto the global south, or the global majority, who are having to pay for our so-called food security.
Yeah, I think that really is the central theme to how all of these podcast episodes talk about the impact, right? It's that these are often, from an economics perspective, described as externalities, and they occur in countries that are in some fields referred to as peripheral. I think I like the way that you've referenced global north and global minority there, because it demonstrates the nature of these impacts. That the global north being wealthier nations like the UK, like France, like Germany, like the US, and the global south being poorer nations with less global control like Senegal and the Gambia, Western Sahara. But that framing around global minority versus global majority, so actually the wealthier nations in the global north are actually a minority number of people who have a disproportionate amount of power, and that those impacts of what we eat are happening on the majority of the world with a disproportionately unpowerful position. So I think that framing really talks nicely about that system in general. But I think my own experience of the salmon and the tomato has really highlighted to me what it is that drives those externalities, that it is the demand for cheap, versatile, year-round and stable products in the global minority that pushes all of those costs onto the global south. Does things like draining of peatlands in Southeast Asia, exploitation of aquifers in southern Spain, and the flattening of landscapes, the changing what is being produced in the global south from being food that can be used to sustain their own citizens and their own economies locally, to food that has to be exported to provide us with enough all year round. And that might not really make sense. I mean, it doesn't make sense for local people, because they're producing a crop that is potentially really damaging vast monocultures just to provide enough to be able to deal with food waste that happens across the system, for example. So yeah, I think the framing of those social and environmental impacts as externalities really says a lot, that that they're not external to the people who are feeling them.
Yeah, I think that's something that stuck with me. Just going back to Raj Patel again, he said how food often appears cheap, but that's because the true costs aren't reflected in the price. It's instead borne by the workers and the communities and the ecosystems that are hidden away from consumer eyes. It's usually in a different country, so it's out of sight, out of mind.
Exactly. Do you remember that Raj's quote around the cost of food, that it was this, I think it was a KPMG report that was then verified loads of different ways with different numbers, that for every $1 of food produced, there's something like $2.40, was it, of costs that aren't factored in. And that's like a math is not mathing kind of situation, right? Nobody is paying for that other than the people whose livelihoods and lives are literally being eroded year on year. There are loads of ways in which corporations are using plays from this playbook to try and get around it. So Farouiza was talking about, if there is an act of deforestation that happens in Indonesia, then if that company is part of a round table, like the round table on sustainable palm, it could take 5 years for an investigation into whether what they've done either is illegal or contravenes the round table rules that allow them to sell under that certification scheme. During those 5 years, those externalities are continuing. And then what happens at the end of that 5 years is that they get a rap on the knuckles and told to stop. So the systems that we have might, these voluntary corporate certifications might look like they are moving towards a better system, but at the same time, they're acting as a shield. So it really is a very incremental step forwards in some cases towards an improvement. And it allows these corporations to act with complete impunity, which a couple of people made a statement that things are moving in the right direction. Phil Howard, for example, that people are now more aware of these plays and what's going on, and that there is a movement towards accountability. But how slow is that? Is it happening in a timescale that allows for meaningful improvement? What about all the people whose lives have been destroyed in the meantime? And this is one of the things as well that struck me from discussions around the impacts of salmon farming, that the report that showed a connection between Norwegian salmon farming and the demand for feed that takes wild fish from West Africa. That report came out in January 2024. Norway now says it doesn't source any of its feed from West Africa. But those impacts have already happened. They've already pushed people to migrate. Their lives have collapsed. So, a lot of these corporations are saying, oh, we're not responsible for that anymore. But actually that responsibility is a legacy, right? So taking a historical lens, again, Jonathan Robbins said that a lot of the major corporations that developed and established oil palm, both from a really damaging, really exploitative way of working in West Africa, and then, expanded that and scaled it up in Southeast Asia. A lot of those corporations are still operating today, and, Unilever being the most famous one. So what kind of accountability do they have for the damage that they've caused historically?
And we've had the same with phosphate, where New Zealand was the world's biggest exporter or importer rather, from Western Sahara of phosphate. And then since the damming reports, that's gone down. But all they did was stockpile here in New Zealand to take the heat off, whilst New Zealand has its own phosphate mines as well. But rather keep those in reserve and reap the benefits. And now while the heat is on, we're not doing that anymore.
I think it's really important to point that out, Ben, that this is happening in this side of the world as well. I mean, we've focused on just a few case studies basically across the series, but they aren't isolated examples.
No.
We've looked at New Zealand dairy industry. It's marketed internationally as clean and green, but it's ruining local environments. It's got connections with the palm oil industry and illegally mined phosphate. So across very different commodities and regions, we're repeatedly seeing the same kind of environmental and social costs being displaced away from the consumers towards communities that have less economical and political power. It's across the board.
And I think this also touches on something that I think it was Phil Howard who said, that economies of scale don't really work often in practice, that you think that the bigger you get as a corporation, the more you streamline your production, the more you become efficient in what you produce. The then subsequent conclusion is the lower the external costs are because you're being very efficient. And that I just don't think is really true. What it in many cases means is that the companies get more and more powerful to the point where they can hide or not admit to the externalities that they're producing. And actually, in many cases, those externalities then become much more intensive, because for the purposes of efficiency, they want to get everything from one place. So they're using one shipment route to source all of their phosphate rather than diversifying, which then you think has a lower risk for a company, but actually might mean some financial inefficiencies. But it's all down to the intensification, right? So it seems like you can't intensify food production in a corporate landscape without also intensifying costs. And those costs are not being paid.
Well, this leads us on to the next theme that we had across the series, and that is food imperialism.
Yeah, so this is a sort of my responsibility, because I've come up with a framing for this podcast, which is to try to talk about this lens of food imperialism, whereby the global minority has a hegemony, has a disproportionate control over how food is produced, exported, imported by and in the global majority in a way that maximizes profit and concentrates power in the food system. And I think in some ways, really things have evolved themselves in terms of how each episode has referenced food imperialism. Explicitly, Raj Patel talked about food imperialism, but many of the other guests mentioned allegories for it. right? So Jennifer Clapp talked about neoliberalism, this freedom of the market deliberately, which relates to things like trickle-down economics that, you know, we're increasingly seeing have not yielded the desired outputs that they claimed to at the beginning. Jennifer Clapp was mentioning that the food system is not a result of a lot of carefully thought out policies around what food is produced and where it goes. It's a very chaotic, unregulated system. But essentially, all these things are funneling the finite resources of the global south into globalized commodity supply chains to feed a minority of wealthy people in the global north. So I think there are concepts like the extraction of resources from the global south that are not only sanctioned by states, but also really pushed into legislation by powerful corporations and lobbying. Again, there's that concept of the productivity hunger paradox, that although we're producing more food, it's less available to the people who need it. And it's because it's being treated as a commodity, it's being sold as a profit. And corporations are concentrating that economic power, that, you know, the corporate control and corporate concentration, as we heard, happens in seed markets where you've only got 4 companies that control 50% of the seed markets, are then preventing people from saving seed and using seed. So they're really controlling the whole of food production through the very point of inception, and that they are essentially acting as de facto states. And again, coming back to this idea of offloading the costs of food on people who are most out of sight, and the idea of hiding the impacts of our food from consumers. And Hazel Healy and Brigitte Weir talked about, you know, that when you think about this, it's really bonkers that the challenge of investigating where our food comes from. You think in the data age, you know, we collect so much data around what food comes into the EU. It should be possible to work out what food comes from where. And it took Hazel and Brigitte 2 years to investigate where, in the case for their interview, they were talking about sea bass being cultured in Turkey. It took 2 years to find concrete evidence that they were sourcing their fish feed from Senegal, where fish populations have been widely known to be unsustainable for a really long time. And yet the MSC and ASC, these standards that look after sustainability of marine and aquaculture resources, didn't know. These organizations that are supposedly looking after certification couldn't find out themselves, and it took these investigative journalists 2 years to work that out. It really demonstrates how hidden things are, and that is a corporate play from the food imperialist playbook, to try to continue to keep things hidden, because that's where their power lies, is to have people going to a supermarket, buying things, not thinking about where they come from, and for any kind of transparency to be really difficult to develop. And that's not to say that, you know, transparency in food supply chains is the be all and end all, because, you know, as Raj Patel quite pointedly said, you know, in many ways, transparency doesn't mean much, because it just shows how much we're effed. I think there are lots of ways in which transparency could help in a system that functioned, that had punitive responses for demonstrable, unacceptable externalities. But I mean, he's right in that transparency alone doesn't serve in a system that won't prevent the outcomes from happening when we know that they are. But as Hazel and Brigitte said, they went to supermarkets, they went to certification bodies and said, you know, this is what's happening with Turkish sea bass, and it's being imported into the UK, and they didn't really get much of a response. So that demonstrates the system is broken. When you've got different spokes of a wheel, different parts of a picture, which should be, you know, you shine light on something, it's bad, it's clearly bad, that should result in a response. But when it doesn't, that really shows that there are other plays going on that are keeping the status quo. And I think that's really the central theme to this, that there are so many ways in which food imperialism is ensuring that our food system remains broken and remains profitable, that, any solution in isolation won't work to make a better, fairer food system.
The term food imperialism was certainly new to me before we started conceiving this whole project. And I'm sure it is to most of our listeners at the start of the series. Now, a little behind the scenes, before we start recording with all of our guests, you always invited and encouraged our guests to say, hey, if you want to mention or talk about food imperialism, please feel free to do so. And what was fascinating was they all had something to say. So it's interesting that it's a concept many of us haven't come across yet. It's actually quite prevalent and people had opinions on it. So it really opened our minds to this throughout this whole series.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we didn't get into the recording because it was part of our intro when we first met Harriet was that she said she's not a fan of isms. And I can sort of understand that there's a tendency to label things and form these frameworks, and actually they don't contribute much to understanding just by saying this is what it is. It's neoliberalism, it's food imperialism. And I think that is definitely true when you have a concept like neoliberalism that many people don't understand, many people struggle to define or to explain. What I like about food imperialism is that it aims to combine lots of different frameworks in a way that makes it easier for people to spot. So part of the work that I've done on food imperialism is trying to come up with this framework of plays and things that happen that are actually the result of very deliberate power at play. And that's what it's all about, right? It's about disproportionate power at play. And so I think the reason that lots of people had things to talk about, and the reason that like the vast majority of people we invited to the podcast said yes, was that it spoke to them in ways that paralleled their own understanding. So even people who didn't explicitly mention food imperialism had things to say about neoliberalism. They had things to say about externalities and corporate control, corporate power, a lack of transparency. These are all components of food imperialism and the result of food colonialism and imperialism in general, right? So Harriet Friedman talked about the British and US imperialism and their approach to food. So it's not so much like a separate concept as a way of thinking that touches upon lots of other concepts. And my hope with food imperialism is that it is a useful outreach tool that helps explain things in a slightly different way when you're explicitly thinking about food.
I found it really, really helpful because it connects all of these seemingly separate stories and issues. And, it's going to be helpful for consumers too, because it's an important concept to understand, because as a consumer, we look at individual products or the choices that we think we have, but really we should be examining the power structures that are shaping our entire food systems.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, a lot of the time consumers do. I remember speaking to a friend who said she stopped going food shopping with friends because she would just spend a huge amount of time stood in supermarket aisles, trying to choose between palm oil or plastic or fair trade versus organic, and feeling really guilty about whatever she ended up going home with anyway. And I think what I like about food imperialism is it shows that there's this vast history of colonialism and imperial control and corporate power that mean that the choices you're being told you can make to make the world a better place are not real choices and don't have the power that we are being told they have. I mean, can you imagine like the power of organizations like Unilever, like a multi-billion-dollar company that is saying that, yeah, you can change what we produce just by buying something different, but you can only have these choices. Like it's obviously ridiculous. And so I think that does in a way help us to feel a little bit better about trying to live within a broken system, that it's not in our power and it's not our responsibility to feel that we can change the system just by buying things alone. Yeah, there's definitely things that can happen when you start to buy a bit more carefully. But I think first and foremost, that is to live within your own moral compass and to feel like you're trying, if it's within your economic means, right? But for sure, you're not going to change the world by buying a different type of butter.
Finally, we heard some really inspiring ways in which people are imagining new, fair food systems where democracy and diversity and sustainability are core components. So, what did you guys think were the key takeaways here?
Yeah, I think this was what was really nice. We always try to end each interview with something positive, or at least give the space for a positive takeaway. And actually, most people did. Most people said, yeah, look, there are signs that people are fighting back. There are signs that things might be getting a bit better. But what I loved about the final episode was that across the 4 people we spoke to, Anitra Nelson, Millian Belay, Chris Mage, and Ali Thomas, there were demonstrable actions, interventions through which there were various different scales of positive response. Not only thinking about what a better food system might look like academically, politically, systemically, but actually also living that in the moment. So that there are ways in which we can live that take back control, that build a sense of democracy around what food gets produced, what food we eat, and what the resultant impacts of that production system would be. So, we heard from Anitra about this concept of degrowth, which is rejecting this really pervasive idea that constant economic growth is a good thing. And when you start to realize just how normalized that is, and you learn about what would it look like to buy a bit less, but the idea that actually using a little bit less might be good, when you think about what that means in terms of how an economy is assessed quantitatively, it's assessed through GDP, through growth. So an economy would fail if it moved towards degrowth, but it would be using a bit less and it would be wasting a bit less, and people would have more money for a rainy day. So that concept of degrowth is super interesting, I think. She also talked about aggressively shortening transnational food supply chains, so buying locally to try to reduce the chance that the impacts of what you're buying in terms of food are being pushed onto people and places out of sight, without jurisdiction, without the same kind of social support that we would have in our home countries. And again, this concept of democratic control over food production. So rather than being told what our choices are, we can take an active choice over them. But I think the comment that she had that stuck with me the most was that it's not just an ideal, it's something that you can live now. And she lives and works in communities that are degrowth communities. They are looking after one another. She mentioned concepts of conviviality, which means really looking after the community, enjoying life and enjoying food rather than being a slave to what's being put in front of us. And then we also had such a fascinating discussion with Millian Belay about replacing this traditional idea of food security with food sovereignty. And so this really important concept of food sovereignty, that there's this ability to have more control over what's being produced, not only what's being produced and where, but also that it has this sensitivity, that it's culturally appropriate. That interestingly tied into what Crystal Bennis was saying about the food aid that's provided to Sahrawi people in refugee camps in Algeria, that a lot of the food aid they're given is completely culturally inappropriate and completely nutritionally devoid. And so there, this idea of food sovereignty, having them have a say over what they eat is really important. But it's sort of this idea that grassroots communities have authority over their own land and their own seed and their own agricultural economies. Interestingly, there's been this movement towards a more nuanced idea of food security. So I definitely recommend listeners who are interested in food sovereignty and food security to have a look at Jennifer Clapp's work on the 6-pillar definition of food security, which moves away from this idea that food is just present and accessible to citizens, towards, there being lots of different aspects that it's environmentally sustainable and doesn't have undue impacts and is culturally appropriate. So that work is super interesting, and I think that lends itself to a more nuanced and appropriate definition of food security. But it has been in the past a bit of a debate, division between food security versus food sovereignty, and that's definitely not the way things are going in the future, which gives me hope. Amelia Mbile also talked about agroecology, this idea of producing food in a really environmentally sustainable way that not only doesn't take from the land, which is what intensive traditional agriculture does, it's continually extracting resources, it's putting in fertilizer and pesticides to produce a maximum output of a crop, but it's degrading soils, it's damaging ecosystems, it's reducing biodiversity, it's poisoning water, as we heard from New Zealand as well. Agroecology allows an improvement of the soil, an improvement of biodiversity at the same time as producing enough food to feed people. And so, that ties into what Chris Major was saying at the end as well about the need for small scale producers that are more resilient to the kinds of shocks that we're seeing right now with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz that's cutting off fertilizer supplies. And, again, I think that shows the importance of the times we're in, right? So we were doing those interviews in February 2026. We're now in June. The Straits of Hormuz are still closed. So, I mean, in a way, it's nice that the podcast is still on topic,
Relevant.
but it's still relevant, but horrendous that those supplies have been cut off for so long. But also, how many of us knew that inorganic fertilizer was coming from primarily from the Strait of Hormuz, right? That was news to me, and I study food systems, probably showing my ignorance there. But it just goes to show that there's a lot of chatter on social media and LinkedIn about, the people who are resilient to that fertilizer crisis are the agroecological producers who don't need it. And again, a food imperialism plays. You can't control people who don't need your inputs. So, of course, you want everybody to be using fertilizer and seeds and pesticides, because then you can control them. And if they don't, they're sort of a bit dangerous because they're just relying on the land and they're outside your reach. And then I think finally, this sort of repeated mention of collective organization against sort of capitalist enclosure that actually demonstrates just how long land enclosure and capitalism in relation to food have been going on, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. This is not something new. This is something that has, if you read, I think it's Stuffed and Starved, Raj Patel's book, it really talks about that, the history of land enclosure. It might be A History of the World Through 7 Cheap Things, both amazing books, definitely worth reading. But it just goes to show how long these corporate plays have been in the offing and the development, but how powerful collective organization are at getting control back, and that there are really great examples, workers' movements in South America, for example, where people are fighting back. So that gives me hope as well.
For our listeners, there's two key things that we always repeat. Firstly, the ability to have a choice with what you choose to buy and the food you put on your plate is a privilege. So we should, not forget that. And secondly, it's about progress, not perfection. So we've learned a lot of things that may have derailed what we thought was doing right and may not be anymore. But it's not about that. It's about trying to keep doing better. And I think we've got to keep that perspective for our listeners as well.
I think we learn a lot of information in this series that has the potential to make a listener feel incredibly angry and possibly a little bit powerless with the sheer scale of everything that's going on. So I just want to add in, if you're in that mindset where you feel like you're just one tiny little tadpole stuck in a very big pond, please remember that at the end of the day, these food systems are human creations, which means they can be changed by humans for the better. And we are seeing that play out with some of these excellent examples that we've had. What this series has really revealed to me again and again is that the people most marginalised by the global food system are also the people that hold immense knowledge and resilience and they're creating change in these social movements, and we can all play a part in that in our own way.
I think that's so right. And I would also point to our website, thesalmonandthetomato.org, has a section on actions that people can take as consumers, as producers, as wholesalers, and as politicians. And there's a whole diversity of things that we can do. But I think the most powerful one, as Raj Patel said, is to organize, to get together so that you're not alone and you're sharing all of these tools and knowledge. But when you work in a system that is so hidden and things are so opaque, the most important thing is to have conversations and to learn. And that does mean that what we learn, a lot of it is pretty depressing. It doesn't mean that this is new. This has been going on for a long time, but it sort of makes that all the more powerful to get together and remember community. And what Harriet Friedman was saying about the disconnect from the land, that's one of the central plays of food imperialism, is to drive a wedge between people and the land. So get out there, grow some vegetables, right? And it does absolute wonders for your mental health, but also gets you understanding what it means to make food and to reconnect. So, I mean, I think we could talk about this for so long. We already have. We've got hours of conversations in our podcast with such amazing people. It just goes to show how much there is to discuss, right? But let's continue these discussions around the table as our listeners go about preparing and eating some delicious food. But I think we're going to have to call it a day there. What an amazing series this has been.
It really has. To you, the listener, thank you for joining us on Edible Empire, and a huge thank you to all of our guests as well. This has been an incredible journey. We hope we've left you satisfied. If you are hungry for more, stay subscribed, because we're giving you the sweetest of treats. Every individual interview will be published in full, including Harriet Friedman's thoughts on isms.
As always, check out the website for the show notes and more information about the podcast series and the wider project called The Salmon and the Tomato. But for now, from all of us, thank you and goodbye.